Summer, 1943, somewhere in the American Midwest. The train cut through the plains like a moving cage. Inside, rows of weary German soldiers stared through barred windows, their uniforms still dusted with North African sand. The last thing they remembered was surrender, the end of the Afrika Korps beneath the desert sun. Now, as dawn broke across an unfamiliar continent, they waited to see the enemy's homeland. They expected ruins, ration lines, and broken roads, a struggling nation hidden behind its propaganda. Instead, the horizon unfolded into order and abundance. Endless fields of wheat shimmered beneath steel windmills. Factory chimneys rose in the distance, not smoking ruins but living industry. Neon signs flickered even in daylight. Trucks, cars, and tractors moved along perfect highways, a world in motion. The prisoners fell silent. One leaned closer to the window and whispered half to himself, "So this is America." Another followed his gaze, eyes narrowing in disbelief. For the first time since the war began, a thought settled over them all. Perhaps they had never truly understood what power looked like. In the spring of 1943, the last remnants of the Afrika Korps found themselves cornered in Tunisia. For 2 years they had fought across the desert, from the burning sands of Libya to the shattered ridges of the Mareth Line, under the banner of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. But the campaign had turned against them. The supply lines that once stretched from Europe to Africa had been severed by Allied sea power. The Luftwaffe's airfields were gone. The desert that once promised glory became a trap. By May 13, 1943, it was over. More than 250,000 Axis troops, Germans and Italians alike, laid down their arms. It was the largest mass surrender since Stalingrad. But unlike the frozen death march of the Eastern Front, their captors here were American. The prisoners expected brutality. They had been told that the Americans were a crude people, half-trained, undisciplined, driven by money and machines. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a racially divided, morally corrupt land barely held together by industrial greed. Yet as Allied trucks rolled into the surrender zones, the men inside carried not whips but cigarettes, water, and cans of food. At first, the Germans were wary. Some refused to eat, thinking the rations poisoned. But hunger softened suspicion, and soon thousands of hands reached out for the olive green tins marked U.S. Army rations, meat and beans. It was their first encounter with American abundance, a preview of what was to come. The next question was what to do with them. North Africa could not hold so many captives. The British camps in Egypt and Libya were already overflowing, and so, in one of the most complex logistical undertakings of the war, the United States agreed to take them. Over the next 2 years, more than 370,000 German POWs would cross the Atlantic under armed guard, carried aboard Liberty ships and converted troop transports. The decision was strategic and moral. Housing prisoners in America would relieve Allied supply chains overseas, provide much-needed agricultural labor at home, and perhaps most importantly, serve as a living demonstration of democratic strength. The War Department, guided by the Geneva Convention of 1929, set strict standards. Every prisoner was to receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Work was permitted but not forced. Beatings were forbidden. Interrogations could not use coercion. For many Germans, it was the first time they experienced rules that limited a victor's power. Their journey to America was long and silent. The convoys left from Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca, moving westward across a hostile Atlantic patrolled by U-boats. Many prisoners, still indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, believed the Americans would execute them or send them to forced labor camps. But when they landed, in ports like Newport News, Virginia, Norfolk, and Boston, they found something entirely different. They were met not by soldiers with bayonets, but by clerks with clipboards. Their names were recorded, their ranks confirmed, their personal belongings cataloged and stored. Each man received an identification tag stamped PW, prisoner of war. Then came the medical checks, delousing, and uniform exchange. Their old field gray tunics were replaced with denim work clothes marked with large white letters, PW. From there, the men were loaded onto troop trains bound for camps scattered across the American heartland: Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Iowa. The routes ran deep into the Midwest, through towns untouched by war, And that was where the real shock began. At first, the trains passed fields that seemed ordinary, but as the miles rolled on, the landscape changed into something no German soldier could reconcile with the image of a decadent America. The land was green, organized, and alive. Gasoline stations gleamed with polished pumps. Children waved at the passing trains. Rows of new cars sparkled in front of dealerships. These were not the ruins of a desperate enemy. This was a civilization untouched by bombs, running at full speed while the rest of the world burned. Many of the prisoners turned away from the windows, confused and silent. One officer, a veteran of Tobruk, wrote later in his diary, "They told us America was weak, but the land outside the train window looked like power itself. What they saw was not just wealth, it was scale. The United States was not fighting a defensive war, it was producing one." The trains would roll for days before reaching the camps, each mile pulling the prisoners deeper into a country whose strength they had never imagined existed. They had come expecting vengeance. Instead, they were about to witness something far more unsettling, kindness backed by industry. And soon, they would learn that America's true weapon was not the gun or the tank, but the way it built, fed, and treated even its enemies. The train rolled through the night, its rhythm steady, the windows dimly lit. Outside, the vast American heartland stretched endlessly, silent towns, glowing billboards and long lines of silos rising like towers. Inside, the German prisoners watched in disbelief. They had been told that America was a land of chaos, of racial decay, of corruption, of violence. Yet what they saw through the glass contradicted every lesson drilled into them by years of propaganda. Clean streets, working lights, families waving from porches. Every station stop revealed order. Policemen tipping their hats, workers in pressed uniforms, schoolchildren walking with books in their hands. In Europe, everything was rationed. In America, everything seemed overflowing. When the trains finally reached their destinations, the prisoners were led through open gates into sprawling compounds lined with barracks, watchtowers, and flagpoles. Each camp bore a number, not a name. Camp Swift, Texas; Camp Algona, Iowa; Camp Concordia, Kansas. Some held 2,000 men, others nearly 10,000. They braced for cruelty, but the guards did not shout. Orders were clear, firm, and calm. Meals were served at regular hours, hot, plentiful, and unfamiliar. Bacon, white bread, potatoes, and coffee. Some refused at first, thinking it a trick. Then hunger won, and soon the dining halls filled with the sound of spoons and quiet astonishment. Every man received 3 full meals a day. By Geneva Convention rule, POWs were to eat the same rations as U.S. soldiers. For men who had fought on half rations in the desert, it felt surreal. Some even gained weight within weeks. In the camp infirmaries, American doctors treated malaria, dysentery, and shrapnel wounds without discrimination. The Red Cross inspected the camps regularly. Even Nazi officers, used to commanding with fear, found themselves subject to rules of fairness and equality they did not understand. One German lieutenant wrote home, "They feed us as if we were their own. They say nothing of revenge. I cannot explain this America." Outside the fences, life went on untouched by war. The prisoners could hear trains passing, church bells ringing, radios playing swing music from distant farmhouses. They worked in nearby fields, harvesting wheat or picking cotton, supervised by a single unarmed guard. None escaped, not because they couldn't, but because there was nowhere better to run. The most striking moment came when the first work details were sent into American towns. German soldiers, still wearing PW on their backs, found themselves laboring beside American farmers. At first, there was silence, mutual suspicion. Then slowly the ice broke. A shared cigarette, a nod of thanks, a meal brought out to the field. In some communities, farmers invited the prisoners to Sunday dinners. It was against regulation, but few reported it. They saw things they had never imagined existed in wartime. Department stores with full shelves, trucks loaded with fruit, newspapers filled not with propaganda but with argument. In Germany, even a whisper of dissent meant prison. In America, disagreement was printed in black and white for anyone to read. The shock deepened. Among themselves, the prisoners began to argue. Some still clung to Hitler's image of a decadent democracy. Others whispered that perhaps they had been lied to. The guards said little, but their discipline and restraint spoke volumes. Many POWs noticed the racial segregation of the American South. something that both confused and disturbed them. Yet even that contradiction reinforced a larger truth. America's strength was not in perfection, but in openness. It was a country that could fight, argue, and still build together. The U.S. government understood the psychological power of these impressions. Through a program quietly called Reeducation Through Experience, officials sought not to indoctrinate but to expose. They allowed access to newspapers, films, and even English language courses. German teachers among the prisoners were encouraged to hold discussions on democracy, freedom, and human rights. At first, the Nazis among them resisted fiercely. They controlled camp councils, intimidated moderates, and tried to preserve ideological order. But the longer they remained, the harder it became. Each factory visit, each newspaper, each small act of kindness wore away the certainties they had brought from the Reich. They had arrived in America as conquerors who had failed. Now they were becoming witnesses to something that could not be conquered, a society powered by belief in itself. Many began to write home, describing what they saw. Censors blacked out names and locations, but the message was clear. America is not weak. It is something else entirely. And as they settled into their routines, working, reading, observing, a quiet transformation began. They had lost the war on the battlefield. Now they were losing it in their minds. For many of the captured soldiers, the first weeks in America felt like disorientation more than imprisonment. They had expected the hard lines of a conqueror's camp, barbed wire, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they found decency. Guards spoke to them without shouting. Commanders enforced rules but not cruelty. Inside the camps, they received mail, medical care, and time. When sickness spread, American nurses entered the barracks to check temperatures and hand out medicine. To the Germans, it was unthinkable, women in uniform caring for the enemy. Letters later collected by the Red Cross show the shift in tone. One wrote home, "They treat us like human beings. Even the guards smile." Another, "Here, a man can be a prisoner and still be respected." It was not sentimentality, it was shock. Years of Nazi propaganda had described Americans as racially inferior mongrels, incapable of culture or discipline. But the prisoners saw something else: quiet competence, efficiency, and fairness. In many camps, guards were only a few years older than the captives they watched. When work details ended, both groups sometimes sat smoking on the same fence line, talking about families and food. The difference between victor and vanquished blurred. That simple humanity, unforced, unplanned, began to do what no propaganda campaign could. It dissolved fear. And in its place came an uncomfortable question. If America was everything we were told to despise, why did it feel so decent? Beyond the camp fences lay the most visible truth: America's machine power. POWs working in agriculture or light industry witnessed the scale firsthand. They saw fields plowed by tractors larger than tanks, harvesters cutting acres an hour, factories where every worker had a specific task and no machine ever stopped. In Germany, workers had been drilled by slogans about sacrifice. In America, production itself seemed effortless, as if the country breathed industry. One German engineer, captured in Tunisia, was assigned to a machine shop in Texas. He later wrote, "Everything runs without shouting. Everyone has their part. The smallest farm here has more machinery than our whole battalion." This was the arsenal of democracy in motion. Henry Ford's assembly lines, General Motors' aircraft engines, and endless rail cars of steel and food. The German prisoners knew their own country's factories had been bombed into rubble. Yet here, across the ocean, the smoke from chimneys meant life, not ruin. They began to understand something the Reich had refused to see: that industrial power, when coupled with freedom, could outbuild any tyranny. Even the act of feeding prisoners was a demonstration. Each camp kitchen prepared thousands of meals 3 times a day without ration shortages. The logistics alone, bread, meat, milk, coffee, and vegetables arriving daily from across the continent, showed an efficiency that defied imagination. To men raised in a culture of scarcity and control, America's abundance was both humbling and terrifying. A former Wehrmacht officer later reflected, "We believed that individualism was weakness, but here it made strength. Everyone did his work, and together they built a mountain of power." Inside the camps, another battle unfolded, not between armies but within minds. Among the prisoners were hardened Nazis, still convinced of racial destiny and final victory. They organized secret cells, enforced loyalty, and punished dissenters. Some wore improvised armbands holding camp trials for those they accused of treason. But outside, reality contradicted every word of the Führer's creed. America's guards were young, disciplined, and racially diverse. They saw black soldiers, Jewish officers, and immigrants in uniform, men who fought side by side with equal rank and respect. That image struck harder than any speech. To soldiers raised on the idea of Aryan superiority, it was impossible. And yet, it worked. One POW later recalled, "When I saw a colored man giving orders to a white soldier, and the white man obeyed, I understood that everything we believed was false." The German officers tried to suppress such talk, but the silence spread like a whisper. The illusion of the Reich, unity through race, purity through obedience, and that had no power here. America was loud, diverse, and argumentative. And yet it functioned, stronger than any totalitarian order. The ideological battle shifted further when the U.S. began distributing German-language newspapers and magazines. The articles covered the war truthfully: the fall of Hamburg, the bombing of Berlin, the retreat in Italy. At first, many dismissed them as propaganda. Then came the confirmation from the Red Cross bulletins and from letters home. Reality was catching up. The Nazi officers could no longer contain it. Their authority eroded day by day, not through punishment or persuasion, but through observation. One American camp commander summarized it best: "We did not argue with them. We just let them see." What they saw was devastating, not to their bodies, but to their beliefs. They began to understand that America's greatest strength wasn't its factories or its food, but the simple fact that it didn't fear truth. The prisoners had entered the camps as soldiers of a totalitarian empire. Now, day by day, they were becoming witnesses to a living democracy, one that functioned not through fear, but through faith in ordinary people, and soon, that quiet education would evolve into something deliberate. A campaign designed not to punish, but to enlighten. By late 1944, the U.S. War Department had recognized what was quietly unfolding inside the camps, an unplanned but powerful psychological shift. German prisoners, exposed daily to the reality of American order and abundance, were beginning to question their old beliefs. Washington decided to turn that process into policy. It was called Reeducation Through Experience. Instead of propaganda leaflets or lectures, the program relied on simple exposure: newspapers, films, music, and books that reflected life in a free society. Camp libraries expanded, stocked with German classics, translated American literature, and even volumes banned under the Reich. Prisoners who could teach were encouraged to organize classes. Debates were held about democracy, freedom, and responsibility. The key was subtlety. No one forced them to listen. No one demanded conversion. They were allowed to think, something they had not been permitted to do in years. The results were quiet but profound. In Camp Algona, Iowa, a group of POWs staged a Christmas play that portrayed peace, forgiveness, and the futility of hate. The American guards applauded. Several of the German actors wept afterward, realizing they had said aloud words that would have been considered treason at home. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, prisoners volunteered to teach English to new arrivals. When asked why, one replied simply, "Because I want to understand the people who defeated us." Psychologists visiting the camps noted the pattern. The more the prisoners interacted with American civilians, the faster their ideological rigidity collapsed. The experience of being treated as human, while their own regime treated enemies as subhuman, struck deeper than any lecture. One camp officer summarized it in his report: "We have learned that kindness is the most efficient form of re-education. Beyond the fences, America revealed its soft power. On rare trips outside the camp into factories, sawmills, or farms, German POWs encountered the full spectrum of American life. They saw stores overflowing with goods despite the war. They saw movie theaters open every night, ice cream parlors crowded with families, and soldiers home on leave holding hands with their sweethearts. These were simple things, but to men raised under a dictatorship, they represented something immense: normalcy under freedom. Some prisoners listened to radios, broadcasting jazz and swing music, rhythms once banned by Goebbels as degenerate. Yet even those who claimed to hate it found themselves tapping along. Others became fascinated by baseball, trying to decode its rules and cheering for teams whose names they barely knew. Each small experience chipped away at the myth that democracy was weak or decadent. Instead, it appeared energetic, confident, alive. At Camp Concordia, several German officers organized a symphony orchestra with instruments provided by local townspeople. They performed Beethoven and Brahms in the camp auditorium, while American families sat among the audience. The applause that followed was thunderous. One musician later wrote in his memoir, "That night the fences disappeared. We were no longer enemies, just men who loved the same music." To the U.S. government, such moments were not accidents. They were the quiet victory of ideas. Every cultural encounter, every act of shared humanity, was a message more powerful than any political statement. The Nazi regime had built its empire on control of information and fear of difference. America, in contrast, disarmed its captives through openness. Beneath the daily routine, the U.S. Army maintained a deliberate consistency: discipline without cruelty, order without humiliation. Each camp followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. German officers retained their rank and saluted their American counterparts. Camp newspapers were allowed under supervision. Religious services were held every Sunday. This was not just morality, but it was strategy. American leaders understood that how they treated these men would shape post-war Germany. Colonel Edward Davison, head of the Special Projects Division, described it bluntly: "We cannot beat fascism only on the battlefield. We must show them what it means to live without it." Davison's team quietly selected educated POWs, teachers, students, engineers, and introduced them to a publication called Der Ruf, The Call. It was a German-language magazine written by prisoners for prisoners. Its articles discussed philosophy, democracy, and Reconstruction. It encouraged debate, not obedience. For some, it was the first time they had seen criticism of their own government printed freely in their language. The reaction was mixed. Some Nazis denounced it as poison. Others secretly saved every issue. By 1945, Der Ruf had become a movement. Its editors later helped found Germany's first post-war democratic newspapers. The experiment had worked beyond anyone's expectation. What began as mere captivity had become a classroom. By the end of 1944, American officers reported that open Nazi sentiment had collapsed in most camps. Prisoners debated politics, read Steinbeck, and argued over the meaning of liberty. One officer wrote, "They arrived as believers. They will leave as thinkers." And that ultimately was the quiet genius of America's war of ideas. It did not demand surrender of the body. That had already happened. It pursued something harder: the surrender of false belief. The war outside the fences still raged. In Europe, cities burned and empires fell. But behind those fences, another kind of victory was taking shape. One without bombs or guns. The prisoners who had once saluted Hitler were now saluting the humanity of those who had defeated them. They didn't know it yet, but the transformation inside those camps would echo across post-war Germany, shaping how a nation rebuilt itself from ruin. By the winter of 1944, news from Europe reached the camps with an almost physical weight. The Reich was burning, Allied bombers ruled the skies. German cities that once stood as symbols of strength, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, were now twisted fields of rubble. But inside America, the world looked entirely different. Production lines ran day and night. The sound of industry was constant, the hammering of progress. The prisoners could hear it from their compounds, the far-off drone of engines, the rhythmic clatter of railcars carrying goods, across a continent untouched by war. Then came the moment that would stay with them for life, their first view of America's industrial heart. Some were taken on supervised labor details near shipyards or aircraft factories. They worked under armed guard, repairing crates, loading timber, or cleaning machinery. But their eyes absorbed everything. They saw factories stretching for miles, conveyor belts moving like arteries, workers, men and women, side by side in coordinated precision. No overseers shouting, no slogans. just quiet efficiency. At one airfield, a group of German mechanics was assigned to help move supplies. As they stepped out onto the tarmac, they stopped in silence. Before them stood rows of aircraft, hundreds of them, gleaming, lined wingtip to wingtip under the sunlight. P-47s, B-24s, and C-47s waiting to fly. One of the prisoners, a Luftwaffe technician, whispered, "In Germany, we could barely build 5 planes a week. Here they make 5 before lunch." He wasn't exaggerating. By 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft per year, more than the combined output of Germany and Japan. The prisoners' disbelief turned to awe, and then to resignation. The truth they had tried to deny since Tunisia now stood before them. They had not been defeated by chance or numbers. They had been defeated by a civilization that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast them. At Camp Carson, Colorado, POWs working near a munitions train watched as hundreds of tanks rolled by on flat cars. Shermans, half-track self-propelled guns, the endless column stretched to the horizon. One German captain turned away and muttered, "We never had a chance." Others described the same reaction upon seeing America's food warehouses, row after row of stacked crates labeled "Rations, Europe." While the German front starved, the Americans were feeding both their armies and their enemies. That contrast struck deeper than any lecture. One POW wrote later, "I thought of my mother queuing for bread in Cologne while I carried food that could feed a town. That day I stopped believing in the Reich." Letters home began to change. Censors intercepted them, but many were copied into military intelligence reports. One in particular, from a former Afrika Korps sergeant, stood out. "They have so much that even their prisoners live better than our soldiers." It wasn't arrogance, and it was observation. Another, written from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, read, "I thought the Americans won because of machines. Now I see they won because they believe in something, in themselves." Each line reflected a slow breaking of certainty. What the German army had tried to build through fear, America achieved through faith. Faith in its citizens, its factories, and its system. The prisoners were also beginning to confront another truth, the moral collapse of the regime they had once fought for. By late 1944, Red Cross bulletins confirmed the liberation of concentration camps in Italy and France. Rumors began to spread. At first, many denied them. Then came captured German newspapers printed by the Allies, headlines describing atrocities at Majdanek and Buchenwald. In Camp Swift, Texas, one German officer reportedly burned his party armband after reading the reports. Another asked to see a chaplain. These were small acts, but they marked a turning point. The ideological armor was cracking. An American psychologist stationed in Texas later wrote, "They did not change because we lectured them. They changed because the world they saw here made their old world impossible." Then, in early 1945, the news arrived. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. Hitler's last gamble was over. The Reich was collapsing. Inside the camps, silence fell. There was no celebration, only quiet acceptance. The prisoners began to realize they were witnessing something rare in history. Not just the fall of an army, but the triumph of an idea. One POW wrote in his diary, "The Americans have no Führer, yet they obey. They have no fear, yet they fight." Perhaps that is real strength. For years they had believed that unity required oppression. But here was a nation of individuals, loud, diverse, sometimes chaotic, united not by fear, but by freedom. It was the moment of revelation, the turning point not of battle, but of belief. And soon, as the war in Europe collapsed entirely, that revelation would reach its final, human form. The prisoners' confrontation with defeat, and the uneasy respect they felt for the people who had captured them. Spring, 1945. The war was ending, not with speeches or triumph, but with silence. In the camps scattered across America, German prisoners stood by radios and bulletin boards, listening to the last broadcasts from Europe. The Reich was gone. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. For a long moment, no one spoke. Some turned away. Others simply sat on their bunks staring at the floor. It was not only a nation that had collapsed, but the illusion of invincibility, of destiny, of purpose. The guards said nothing. They didn't gloat. They didn't cheer. They simply lowered the flag to half-staff in respect for the dead on both sides. That gesture broke something inside many of the prisoners. They had been taught to expect mockery, vengeance, the victor's arrogance. Instead, they saw restraint, dignity, and a quiet kind of honor. A former Nazi officer later recalled, "I realized then that they had beaten us not only with weapons, but with character." As the months passed, news of the devastation in Germany trickled through. Letters described bombed-out cities, vanished families, and hunger. In America, the prisoners walked past shelves filled with food. It was unbearable. At Camp Tonkawa, one young soldier, barely 19, asked his guard, "Why don't you hate us?" The American shrugged. "The war's over," he said. "You'll go home soon." For many, that simple answer struck harder than any punishment could. They had been raised in a system where hate was law, where enemies were exterminated, not forgiven. Yet here, in the heart of their captor's country, they found the opposite. The war had turned them into prisoners. America was turning them back into men. In those last months, the U.S. government expanded its Reeducation Through Experience program. Prisoners were allowed to form councils, organize classes, and discuss politics openly. They watched documentary films about the rebuilding of Europe and the founding of the United Nations. One film showed liberated German cities receiving food shipments from the Allies. At first, the audience fell silent. Then applause broke out. Many cried quietly in the dark. For the first time, they saw their conquerors feeding their own families. Inside the camps, conversations changed. Where once they had whispered about the Reich's comeback, they now debated the future of Germany, what kind of nation it could become, and what they themselves might bring back to it. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We came here to learn how to fight. Instead, we learned how to live." Letters from the camps began to reflect this change. The U.S. Office of War Information translated and studied hundreds of them. A common phrase appeared again and again: "We must rebuild without hate." Even the most skeptical among them began to acknowledge a quiet truth, that America's victory was not only material, but moral. By mid-1945, as Allied troops liberated concentration camps across Europe, the full scale of Nazi crimes became undeniable. The prisoners in America were shown the images: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The grainy footage left them stunned. Some refused to believe it at first, insisting it was Allied propaganda. But as testimony poured in, from survivors, from captured German officers, from film reels shot by their own army, denial collapsed. One POW, a former SS supporter, reportedly tore off his insignia and threw it into the campfire. Another fainted while watching footage of emaciated prisoners being pulled from mass graves. An American officer who attended those screenings wrote in his report, "They did not argue. They simply wept." It was the final irreversible turning point, the moment when ideology met reality, and the facade of moral superiority dissolved completely. The day Germany surrendered, May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, came quietly. There were no celebrations in the camps. The German prisoners stood during the morning roll call, silent as the stars and stripes rose over the compound. Then, unexpectedly, some began to salute. Not out of submission, but out of respect. That day, American officers walked among them, shaking hands with men who had once sworn to destroy their country. The war was over, but something deeper had begun: the reconstruction of thought. As repatriation plans were announced, the mood in the camps turned reflective. Some prisoners dreaded going home to a land in ruins. Others saw it as a mission, to carry what they had learned back into the heart of a broken nation. In Camp Concordia, the camp choir sang one final hymn in German and English. "O God, our help in ages past." It echoed across the Kansas plains. To the guards listening outside, it sounded like closure, not of captivity, but of an era. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "We came to America as servants of hate. We left as students of freedom, and in that, perhaps, lay the real turning point of the Second World War, the moment when a defeated enemy became unknowingly the first generation of a democratic Germany." When the trains finally rolled again, this time east, the German prisoners were no longer the same men who had crossed the Atlantic 2 years earlier. They had come to America as captured soldiers of a proud army, They were returning as witnesses to something greater than victory, civilization built without tyranny. The repatriation began in 1946, months after the war's official end. The process was slow. Each man was registered, medically examined, and briefed. Before boarding, they received new uniforms marked Germany. The same ships that had brought them as prisoners now carried them home as free men. For many, the voyage was a blur of silence and reflection. They watched the American coastline fade into the horizon, the factories, the harbors, the cities that had reshaped their understanding of the world. They knew they were leaving a nation that had treated them not as monsters, but as men. When they arrived in Bremen, Hamburg, and Le Havre, the shock was immediate. Where they expected familiar streets, they found ashes. Germany was no longer a land of banners and parades. It was a landscape of rubble and ghosts. The contrast was unbearable. One former POW wrote, "In America, everything was alive. Here, everything is dust. I feel as if I have returned to the ruins of a lie. Cities lay flattened, infrastructure gone, families scattered. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce, hope even more so. But among the returnees, something new existed. A quiet conviction that Germany could rebuild differently. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. A democracy that worked. An economy that fed everyone. A system that allowed argument instead of punishment. These men, once indoctrinated by the Reich, now carried fragments of another ideology, not imposed by force, but absorbed through example. In the American zone of occupation, Allied authorities noticed it quickly. POWs recently returned from the United States showed distinct differences from those released from Soviet captivity. They were calmer, more cooperative, and openly critical of Nazi leadership. Many volunteered for reconstruction work. Some even helped American officers administer local governments. Colonel Edward Davison, who had overseen the U.S. reeducation efforts, called them our silent missionaries. Without orders, without speeches, they spread the lessons they had learned behind the wire. Fairness, restraint, individual responsibility. Some became teachers. Others joined local councils or helped organize the new Christian Democratic Union and Social Democratic Party. Their influence was subtle, but enduring. The first human foundation of what would become West, Germany's democracy, a former officer from Camp Algona later told a journalist, "I learned more about freedom behind the wire than in all my years before it." It was not an exaggeration. In camp newspapers and diaries, they had debated subjects once banned, religion, human rights, and accountability. Now those discussions became the intellectual seedbed for Germany's recovery. The U.S. military observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The moral experiment, treating the enemy with dignity, had succeeded beyond expectation. Reports from 1946 noted that re-education, through exposure, had reshaped over 60% of German POWs in measurable ways, reduced hostility, increased understanding of democratic values, and rejection of Nazi ideology, and yet the Americans did not celebrate. They knew the real test lay ahead, whether these men could carry that change into a nation still struggling to survive. Back in Germany, those returning found hunger, grief, and uncertainty. Some faced hostility, seen as collaborators for having worked with the Americans. Others quietly held on to what they had learned. One wrote to a former guard in Texas, "I remember your country every day. You showed me what power with mercy looks like. We have to build something like that here." For America, the story of the German POWs was largely forgotten, a footnote in a global war. But for the men who had lived it, it was life-changing. They had arrived as enemies of freedom. They left as its unlikely witnesses, and though few spoke of it publicly, the memory of orderly farms, open debates, and unarmed guards lingered. Proof that a nation's true power is not in its weapons, but in how it treats even those who once sought to destroy it. By 1947, the last major groups of German prisoners had left American soil. The camps stood empty, their fences dismantled, their barracks turned over to veterans' housing or farm storage. The war was long over, but the quiet experiment America had conducted within those fences was only beginning to reveal its consequences. In Germany, a broken nation was struggling to stand. The streets of Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Cologne were still choked with debris. Rail lines lay twisted. Cities were dark and cold, and yet scattered across those ruins, men who had once been captives of the United States were quietly rebuilding, not with orders, but with ideas. They brought home something their homeland had lost long before 1939, faith in fairness. One former POW described his return to Hanover this way: "In America, I learned that freedom and order are not enemies. Here we must learn it too, or we will never rise again." That simple conviction, shared by thousands, became the invisible foundation of a new Germany. American officials monitoring the reconstruction noticed the pattern almost immediately. Sociological studies conducted by the U.S. Office of Military Government in 1947 revealed that returnees from American captivity consistently showed higher civic participation, lower resentment, and greater acceptance of democratic principles than any other group of demobilized soldiers. By contrast, men released from Soviet camps returned bitter, brutalized, and often politically radicalized. To Western observers, the difference between the two experiences became a moral benchmark, proof that decency could achieve what fear could not. A confidential 1948 report summed it up simply: the democratic seed was planted not in schools or governments, but in the human conscience, Maori's inside barbed wire on American soil. For the Americans, it was an unspoken vindication. They had fought fascism not only with guns but with example, and when the Cold War began to divide the world once more, those lessons took on new meaning. The Germany that emerged from rubble was not the Reich reborn. It was a democracy built, in part by men who had once saluted the swastika, but who now believed in liberty. Many former POWs became teachers, mayors, engineers, and administrators in the young Federal Republic of Germany after 1949. Some even corresponded for years with the American guards and families who had shown them kindness. During the war, in 1955, during official West German visits to the United States, several delegates who had once been POWs returned to the very towns where they had been held. They were welcomed as guests, not enemies. One stood before a crowd in Kansas and said simply, "You defeated us with weapons, but you won us with respect." That line would be reprinted in German newspapers for weeks. The legacy of those years stretched beyond politics. It reshaped memory. When post-war Germany began teaching about the Holocaust, dictatorship, and human rights, many of the educational approaches echoed the Reeducation Through Experience model pioneered in the POW camps: free discussion, open media, and moral responsibility through truth. The idea that democracy must be lived, not imposed, came directly from that wartime contact. And while the world moved on to new conflicts and new ideologies, the story of the German POWs in America remained a quiet testament, a reminder that power guided by conscience can change history more deeply than conquest ever could. In later years, historians would call it the human victory, the triumph of values over vengeance. While Europe rebuilt through politics and treaties, the moral groundwork had already been laid by a generation of men who had seen freedom from behind the wire. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1970s, summarized it with a simplicity that defied time. "When I was captured, I thought America was our enemy. When I went home, I knew it was our teacher. The barbed wire had vanished. The camps were gone. But the echo of what happened within them, that quiet transformation from hate to understanding, remained in both nations' histories. The Americans had set out to win a war. Without intending to, they had also won a peace. In the story of the Second World War, the great machines often take the spotlight: the bombers, the tanks, the thunder of guns across continents. But history's quieter victories are not written in explosions. They are written in moments of restraint. Among barbed wire fences in the heart of America, a moral victory unfolded, one that never made headlines, yet reshaped the post-war world more deeply than any battle. The German prisoners had arrived as soldiers of a totalitarian empire, men who believed they were the chosen guardians of a superior civilization. They left as witnesses to a society that needed no chains, no slogans, no Führer to command unity. What defeated them was not humiliation, but humility. Not punishment, but principle. A democracy that fought with weapons, yes, but governed with conscience. The same factories that forged bombers also built food for their enemies. The same nation that dropped fire on Berlin offered blankets to its captives. And in that contradiction lay the essence of America's strength. Mercy without weakness, power without cruelty. When those men returned to a ruined Germany, they carried something more enduring than orders: memory. Memory of an open press, of guards who didn't shout, of fields that stretched endlessly under the peace of ordinary life. They became the quiet messengers of an idea, that freedom works. That dignity, even in defeat, can rebuild what tyranny destroyed. Today, their story survives not in monuments or medals, but in the calm friendship that grew between two nations once sworn to annihilate each other. The barbed wire rusted away long ago. But the lesson endures, that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the way a nation treats those it no longer needs to fear.